Okay, so you're here because, let's face it, you want to get smarter faster, right? You want those, like, aha moments without drowning in an ocean of information.
Right. That's the goal.
Yeah, and, we're all about those aha moments on this show. This is the deep dive. And today, well, today's a bit of a mind bender. We're going to try to connect the worlds of James Joyce, the author, and M.C. Escher, the master of illusion in art.
Yeah, at first glance, you might be thinking, how do words on a page and, those intricate drawings, those illusions, how do they even relate?
Right, it seems like a stretch, for sure.
Well, we've got this academic paper here. It's called, let me get it right, Joyce and the Drama of Cognition, Escher as a Visual Analogue. It makes a pretty convincing argument that both Joyce and Escher, each in their own unique way, they offer us these deep insights into, well, how we understand the world around us, like our cognition.
So it's not just about appreciating some cool art, right? I mean, dusting off your copy of Ulysses.
No, not at all.
It's about, like, really illuminating how both of these guys, Joyce and Escher, how they make us confront those moments when we suddenly get it. When we understand something.
Right, those aha moments.
Exact.
And that process itself, that can be a form of art, actually.
So where do we even begin with this? Where does the article start?
Well, the article starts with this idea. It says that the more familiar we become with the world, with how our senses work, the less we actually, the less we truly see,
Like we take it for granted.
Yeah, exactly. We just get used to things. It's like, you see the same tree every day, you stop really seeing the tree.
Yeah, I get it.
And that's where artists like Joyce and Escher, they come in, they kind of shake things up. They're like a wake-up call for our brains.
They make you see the tree again, so to speak.
Right, exactly.
So how do they actually, how do they pull this off?
Well, the article talks about their masterful use of, it says, surprise trompe-l'oeil, which, by the way, is French for deceives the eye and tricks the brain.
Trompe-l'oeil, I've heard of that. That's like, those paintings that look so real you could reach out and touch them?
Yeah, like those 3D street paintings.
Right. But how does that apply to Joyce? I mean, he's a writer.
Well, Joyce uses words, of course, but he plays with them. He twists them, he bends them, he creates these verbal illusions, almost like Escher does visually. And the goal, it seems, is to give us a peek behind the curtain to show us how our minds actually work.
So they both kind of mess with our perceptions, but in different ways.
Yeah, and what makes their work so powerful, and the article really emphasizes this, is that they don't just present these illusions, they make them really, really complex. They weave them in with how we already understand the world, our learned responses, our expectations.
So it's like a double whammy, right? They surprise us and they make us think.
Exactly. And it's that combination, that powerful conjunction, as the article calls it, that really makes us stop and pay attention.
Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into Joyce first.
Okay.
He's famous for these moments that he called epiphanies.
Right.
And I think for someone who hasn't, spent a lot of time with Joyce, what exactly did he mean by epiphany? Like, how does that tie into this whole idea of jolting our perception?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Joyce, he was really meticulous about recording these sudden moments of insight. And the article connects this idea of epiphany with this broader historical concept of the illuminated moment, that subtle flash of understanding that's been a recurring theme in art and literature for centuries.
Okay.
And in his earlier work, Stephen Hero, Joyce actually has his character, Stephen Dedalus, define epiphany. He says it's a sudden spiritual manifestation, whether in the vulgarity of speech or gesture, or in a memorable phase of the mind itself.
A sudden spiritual manifestation. That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, it's definitely more than just, noticing something. It's about having this deeper, almost like a revelatory understanding.
Like the scales fall from your eyes and you see the world in a new way.
Exactly. And for Joyce, this epiphany was the ultimate goal. He saw it as the final stage of cognition, the culmination of all those mental processes that lead to understanding. He was really building on ideas from Aquinas, who believed that internal conflicts were just as important for art as external ones. And also from Poe, who said that art is essentially about retracing a powerful emotion.
So for Joyce, the epiphany was the essence of art itself, the moment when perception becomes understanding.
Right.
But the article points out this challenge for literature when it comes to depicting these raw moments of insight, especially compared to visual art.
Yeah, that's a really key distinction. You see, visual art, like Escher's illusions, they can deliver that trick, that mind-bending moment, almost instantly.
Hmm.
You look at an impossible staircase and boom, your brain is struggling to make sense of it. But literature, it unfolds over time. It relies on language, which is more abstract.
Yeah.
So it's harder for literature to capture those initial raw impressions before our minds have had a chance to process them.
Like in Escher, you see the impossible staircase immediately. But in Joyce, you have to read through pages and pages to get to that aha moment.
Yeah, and that's why the article argues that looking at Escher can actually help us understand Joyce better. It's like Escher's work makes those invisible mental processes that Joyce is exploring, it makes them feel almost tangible.
Okay, so Escher is like a visual key that helps us unlock Joyce's wordplay.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of Escher, the article talks about this concept called the strange loop that Douglas Hofstadter came up with.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is exactly?
Sure, sure. So Hofstadter, he describes a strange loop as this kind of self-referential system, like a closed loop, where you move through different levels and then, unexpectedly, you end up right back where you started. Like imagine one of those Escher staircases that keeps going up and up, but then somehow it circles back on itself.
Yeah, I see. Like a Mobius strip almost.
Exactly. It's that kind of mind-bending circularity.
Okay, so when we look at an Escher print and we have that moment where we're like, wait, hold on, let me look at that again. That's the strange loop happening in our own minds.
Yeah, that's exactly what the article argues. When we keep looking at the image, trying to figure it out, our minds are tracing and retracing those visual pathways, trying to resolve the paradox. And that process, that back and forth, that's a reflection of the artistic process that Joyce was so interested in.
So both Escher and Joyce, they create these works that make us go back and forth trying to understand them.
Right, and it's that process of re-examination, that continuous reevaluation, that mirrors the way our own minds work.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connections here. Now, the article uses some specific Escher prints as case studies to illustrate these ideas. Let's talk about Day and Night. How does that one connect with Joyce?
Okay, so Day and Night, that's the one with the birds that kind of morph into each other.
Yeah, the blackbirds and the whitebirds all interlocking.
Right, and the landscape gradually shifts from day to night.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and the article connects this print with Stephen Dedalus's initial stage of perception, the way he describes it in Stephen Hero. He talks about how the mind separates the object from everything else.
Like you see a bird and your mind says, okay, this is a bird and everything else is not a bird.
Yeah, exactly. It's about distinguishing the figure from the ground. And Escher, in Day and Night, he plays with that distinction.
How so?
Well, in the middle part of the print, you can either see the white birds as the figures or the black birds, but you can't see both at the same time. Your brain has to choose one or the other.
Ah, that's trippy.
It is, and it makes you aware of that process of selection, of separating the figure from the ground. And then, Escher takes it further, he gradually flattens those birds, they become part of the background pattern, and even the landscape itself, which looks 3D at first, it gets flattened onto the 2D surface of the page.
So he's playing with our sense of depth, our perception of what's figure and what's ground.
Exactly. And all that visual trickery, it forces us to actively engage with the image, to think about how our brains are making sense of it all.
Okay, so Day and Night messes with our perception of figure and ground. Let's move on to the next case study, the famous waterfall.
Okay, yeah, waterfall, that's the one where the water seems to flow uphill, right?
Yeah, it's one of his most famous illusions. How does waterfall connect with Joyce's ideas?
Well, the article says that waterfall illustrates the second stage of Stevens' aesthetic theory. This is where the mind starts analyzing the object, looking at its parts, how they fit together, its structure.
So we're not just seeing the object anymore, we're starting to analyze it.
Right. And with waterfall, at first glance, it looks like a normal water wheel. The water's flowing downhill.
Like, it all makes sense.
But then when you really focus on the whole structure, you realize the water is actually going uphill.
It's impossible.
It is impossible, but Escher makes it seem plausible.
And that's when we have that aha moment, that realization that something's not quite right.
Yeah, the article calls it an involuntary smile, like you can't help but be amused by the absurdity of it.
Like our brains are trying to reconcile what we're seeing with what we know about physics.
Exactly. And that leads us to Stephen's third stage, which he calls claritas or quidicas. It's like the essence of the thing, the whatness of it.
So we've gone from seeing the object to analyzing it to now trying to understand its true nature.
Yeah, and for Stephen, this is the moment of epiphany. And with waterfall, We reach that epiphany when we realize how Escher tricked us.
By making us think the water was flowing downhill when it was actually going uphill.
Right. And it's only when we re-examine the image, when we trace the path of the water, that we see the trick. And it's almost like a delayed gratification, you know? We have to work for that aha moment.
It's like solving a puzzle.
Exactly.
So the details in Waterfall, the towers, the terraces, they all kind of distract us from the impossible water flow, right?
Yeah, they create this sense of realism that makes the illusion even more effective.
Yeah.
But the key to the whole thing is that Escher is distorting a 3D scene onto a 2D surface. He's breaking the rules of geometry.
He's messing with our sense of space.
Yeah, and the article even mentions the concept of the impossible triangle as a kind of visual aid to understand what Escher's doing. You know, those triangles that seem to fit together but actually can't exist in 3D space.
Ah, yeah, I've seen those.
Well, Waterfall is like an elaboration of that idea, using 3 impossible triangles instead of just one.
So there's even more to unpack in Waterfall than meets the eye.
Exactly. And that moment when you grasp the underlying structure, the geometric trick, that's another kind of epiphany, another aha moment.
So we've talked about how Escher uses visual tricks to create these aha moments. How does Joyce do it with words?
Well, the article looks at the short story, 2 Gallons, from Dubliners. It argues that the epiphany in that story, it doesn't belong to the characters, but to the reader.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we follow these 2 guys, Lenihan and Corley, as they wander around Dublin. And it's only at the very end, when Corley gets money from this young woman, that we realize what's really going on.
What do you mean?
Well, Corley is basically exploiting this woman. And we, the readers, we're like Lenihan. We've been following them, observing them, but we haven't fully grasped the situation until that final moment.
So Joyce is using the narrative structure to create the epiphany for the reader.
Exactly. He's controlling the flow of information, leading us to that moment of understanding.
It's like a literary magic trick.
Yeah, and it all comes back to this idea of the strange loop. Both Escher and Joyce, they create works that make us look and look again and think and rethink.
They engage our minds in this active process of perception and interpretation.
Right. And the article suggests that Escher uses the strange loop mostly to analyze the role of the artist, you know, to reflect on the act of creation.
While Joyce uses it to kind of distance himself from his own work.
Yeah, Joyce was really influenced by Vico, who had this theory of cyclical history. And Joyce, he often uses these loops in his writing to step outside the narrative, to gain a more objective perspective.
So both artists are kind of self-aware, they're conscious of their own creative process.
Exactly, and the article concludes that they both, in their own way, they position themselves outside their art, observing it with detachment.
It's like they're both scientists and artists at the same time.
Right, they're analyzing their own creative process.
And we can see this detachment, this growing distance, in Joyce's own writing, right?
Yeah, the article talks about how he moves further and further away from direct personal reflection in his work. Well, you know, in Dubliners, each story has its own self-contained epiphany. But then, in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he uses this diary format, which is more objective. And then in Ulysses, he throws in all these different elements, like newspaper headlines and catechism. And finally, in Finnegan's Wake, it's like he's completely abstracted from the narrative.
So it's like he's adding layers of complexity between himself and the reader.
Yeah, making us work harder to understand his work.
Okay, so we've talked about epiphanies and strange loops. Now, the article brings up the concept of mirrors and reflections as another link between Joyce and Escher. And, well, Escher obviously uses literal mirrors in his work, but how does Joyce engage with this idea?
Well, Escher, he makes reflections a central part of his art. Like in Three Spheres the Second, he creates this whole scene with these reflective spheres.
I have seen that one. It's amazing how he captures all the reflections and distortions.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that in the center of the composition, right between the artist's reflected eyes, is his own distorted image. The article calls it the still dead center of the artist's ego.
So it's like the artwork itself is a mirror reflecting the artist's mind.
Right, it's like that romantic idea of the artist's inner world being reflected in their art.
Okay, so Escher uses literal mirrors, but Joyce, he doesn't draw himself into his novels, right? So how does he use mirrors?
Well, Joyce, he reflects himself through his characters. Like Stephen Dedalus is obviously based on Joyce himself.
Yeah, but Stephen is not a literal copy of Joyce, right?
No, he's more like a reflection, the distorted image, like those reflections in Escher's Three Spheres too.
I see.
And the article even mentions this critic, R.P. Blackmer, who said that Stephen and Bloom in Ulysses, they represent the two sides of Joyce's own personality.
So his characters are like fragments of himself, reflected and refracted through the lens of fiction.
Exactly. But as Joyce's writing evolves, those reflections become less personal, more abstract. They're embedded in his language, his style, even the way he uses typography.
Wait, typography, you mean like the fonts and the layout of the text?
Yeah, the article argues that even those elements are meaningful in Joyce's work. Like at the end of the Ithaca episode in Ulysses, there's this big black period.
A period, like a full stop.
Yeah, and some critics think it's Joyce's little joke, like a QED quod erat demonstrandum. Like he's saying, I've proven my point.
He's playing with the reader.
Exactly. And then there are those capital letters, S, M, and P, that were added to later editions of Ulysses.
What do those stand for?
Well, they correspond to the three main sections of the novel, and also to the Homeric structure. But they've been interpreted in different ways. Some critics see them as representing the subject, middle, and predicate of a syllogism, like Joyce is emphasizing the logical structure of the novel.
So even the typography is part of his grand design.
Right, and other critics link those letters to medieval pedagogy, the way they used to teach logic. They say the SMP sequence reflects the order of thought, how we process information.
So Joyce is embedding meaning in every aspect of his work, even the visual presentation of the text.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's talk about one more Escher print, Magic Mirror. How does this one relate to Joyce's characters?
Well, Magic Mirror shows these creatures that are constantly changing, morphing as they pass under this mirror.
Yeah, I remember that one. It's like they're both real and unreal at the same time.
Right, and it plays with the relationship between image and object. And the article says that this is similar to how Joyce's characters in Ulysses are presented.
How so?
Well, his characters, they're not always fixed, they change, they evolve, they dissolve and reappear. It's like they're both real people and abstract representations of ideas at the same time.
Like they're more than just characters. They're symbols, archetypes, forces of nature almost.
Exactly. And Ulysses itself, it's all about transforming these flat written words into a living, breathing world in the reader's mind.
And Joyce does that by using multiple perspectives, right? Like we see the same events through different characters' eyes.
Yeah, just like Escher uses multiple perspectives in Day and Night and Magic Mirror.
Yeah.
And Joyce, he uses language as his mirror. He reflects and refracts his characters through different styles, different voices, different ways of using language.
So the language itself is constantly shifting and transforming the characters.
Right, and the article traces this process through different stages. It starts with the characters as seemingly real people.
Yeah.
Then they become more like 2D representations of ideas. And finally, in Molly Bloom, we see this return to a fully embodied flesh and blood character.
It's like a cycle of abstraction and embodiment.
Exactly.
Okay, and Joyce also uses literal mirrors in Ulysses.
Yeah, especially in the Circe episode, which is all about the subconscious. Like, there's this scene where Bloom's reflection is distorted in all these different mirrors.
It's like a hall of mirrors, reflecting all the different facets of his personality.
Right, and each type of mirror distorts him in a different way. The concave mirrors show his pain and vulnerability, while the convex mirrors highlight his joy and sensuality.
So the mirrors are like psychological tools, revealing different aspects of his inner world.
Yeah, and then there's that moment when Bloom and Stephen see themselves as Shakespeare in Bella's mirror.
That's like a merging of identities, a shared epiphany.
Right, and it emphasizes the permeability of these mirrors, how they blur the boundaries between reality and illusion, the conscious and the subconscious.
So it all comes back to this drama of cognition, this exploration of how our minds work, how we perceive and understand the world. And Escher's illusions, they're like visual guides to help us grasp Joyce's more abstract ideas.
Exactly. The article concludes by saying that Escher's work illuminates Joyce's concepts about perception and the artistic process. They both analyze the artist's self-portrait, their own struggles and anxieties. And it quotes Marshall McLuhan, who said that for Joyce, art was about retrieval, reconstruction after a moment of insight.
So they're both trying to capture those aha moments, the moments when we suddenly understand something in a new way.
Right.
So after this deep dive, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they remember about Joyce and Escher?
I think the main takeaway is that both of these artists, in their own way, they give us these amazing insights into how our minds work, how we make sense of the world.
They make us think about thinking.
Exactly.
So for you, the listener, I want you to consider this. Think about other artists in any field, music, dance, whatever. How might they be engaging with these same ideas about perception and cognition? What kind of tricks do they use to make us see the world differently?
That's a great question.
And also, think about your own epiphanies, those moments when you suddenly understand something. How do those moments connect with what we've been talking about today?
It's something to ponder, for sure.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
See you next time.
Please go to finneganswakenotes.net for a full explanation of the text, and please don't forget to hit the like button.